Arizona Territory, 1883, the air was dry and still as gunpowder, and the only sound outside the crumbling chapel was the wind brushing grit across the stone steps where she stood, alone in her wedding dress. Delaney Elder pressed her gloved hands together, her jaw tight, throat burning. The chapel St. Agatha's was supposed to be filled with voices, with the scent of flowers and the weight of vows. Instead, it stood hollow and peeling, abandoned like the promise that brought her here. Dust coated the pews through broken windows. Not a soul had come, not even him. She blinked fast, held her chin high, and stared down the empty road. The sun beat down on her veil, her skirts clinging to her legs. Her parents were buried in Prescott, the last thread of family gone 2 winters ago, and now her fiancé Thomas had vanished, no letter, no word. Just a lie that had led her to this ghost of a church in the middle of nowhere. The ache in her chest cracked wide. Then came the sound of hooves. She turned. A man on a chestnut gelding slowed as he reached the chapel. He reined in, his gaze sweeping over her with quiet concern. He was tall, lean but strong, with sun-dark skin and a scruff of beard along his jaw. Dust clung to his boots and coat. He dismounted without a word. "You all right?" he asked, voice low and steady. His eyes deep and clear locked on hers. Delaney nodded stiffly, though the tears behind her eyes betrayed her. "Yes, no, not really." He took off his hat, ran a hand through his dark hair. "You waiting for someone?" She looked away, her voice cracked. "I was supposed to be married today." He glanced at the chapel, then back at her. "Looks like he had other plans." Delaney exhaled hard, half a laugh, half a sob. "He left me. I came all this way for nothing." The man's brow furrowed. "That's not nothing." She narrowed her eyes. "What do you know about it?" "I know it takes a lot to stand in white and not fall apart." He paused. "Name's Abram Teller. I run cattle about 30 miles west." She wiped her eyes. "Delaney Elder." They stood in silence a moment, the sun shifting behind a high cloud. Abram looked at the chapel again, then at her. "You still want a wedding?" She blinked. "What?" He shrugged a little. "You came here to marry. Maybe it is not too late. You do not even know me." "I know enough. You got grit. And you deserve better than someone who walks away." She stared at him, her heart pounding. "You cannot mean." "I do," he said simply. "I will marry you today, right here. If you want honesty, I have not been able to stop looking at you since I rode up. Something about you feels like home." Delaney's breath caught. Her chest was tight, but not from pain this time. "You would marry a stranger?" "I would marry a woman brave enough to stand alone and still hold her head high." "I would marry you, Delaney." She looked at him as if weighing the years ahead. He was not her plan, but plans had not done her any good. "I do not even know if there is a preacher." Abram turned toward the chapel and whistled. "I know this place. Old Father Brennan used to serve here. He still lives a mile down the ridge. I can fetch him." Delaney hesitated, then nodded. "All right." He mounted up and rode off across the ridge, his figure cutting through the heat like a promise. She sat on the chapel steps, the wind tugging at her veil, her heart beat loud and unsure. But something had shifted, like the day was not broken after all. An hour passed before Abram returned, this time with an old man in a dusty black coat riding beside him. Father Brennan smiled when he saw her. "Well now, I did not expect to perform a wedding today," the priest said, dismounting. "But here we are, you two ready?" Delaney stepped down off the stone step. Abram took her hand. "I am ready," he said. She met his eyes. There was something steady in him, something kind. "I am too." Inside the chapel, Abram brushed off the pews while Father Brennan lit the old altar candles. The sun dipped low outside, throwing golden light against the dusty walls. Delaney stood before the altar, her dress wrinkled from the road, her veil crooked. But when Abram looked at her, his gaze did not see any of that, just her. The ceremony was short. When Father Brennan asked if he took her as his wife, Abram's answer was clear and certain. "I do." Her voice trembled when she answered, but her heart did not. "I do." They kissed, and it was not like in dreams. It was real, warm, surprising, and full of something that felt like the start of everything. Outside, after the priest rode off, Abram helped her onto his horse and climbed up behind her. As they rode west, the sky turned gold and purple. "You sure about this?" she asked quietly. He wrapped his arm around her waist. "I never thought I would marry," he said, "but somehow riding past that chapel today felt like the only right thing I ever did." She leaned back against him. "I never thought someone would choose me like that. I did. And I will keep choosing you." They reached his ranch just after dusk. It sat nestled between two hills, the porch light flickering like a welcome. Inside, it smelled of cedar and coffee. He gave her the bedroom. She changed out of her dress and came back out in one of his shirts, too big and soft. He was at the stove warming beans. "I know it is not much of a wedding supper," he said, "but I will do better tomorrow." She walked to him, touched his arm. "This is more than I ever dreamed." He turned and they stood close. "I meant it, Delaney. I married you because something in me knew it had to be you." She reached up, resting her fingers on his chest. "And I said yes because I felt the same." He kissed her again, slower this time, and it felt like the beginning of something real. Outside, the desert wind blew soft against the windows. Inside, two people who had nothing that morning now had each other. And they were not alone anymore. The next morning, Delaney rose to birdsong threading through the shutters and the faint creak of hooves being led across packed earth. The room held a quiet warmth, rough-hewn walls, a braided rug beneath her bare feet, and a small mirror tacked above a basin. She touched her hair, still pinned from the day before, and studied the woman looking back. Not a bride left behind, not anymore. She stepped into the main room, her sleeves rolled and eyes still soft with sleep. Abram was outside, his back to her, leading the gelding toward the corral. A second horse trailed behind, its coat dappled gray and its step light. He hadn't seen her yet, and she stood a moment at the doorway, watching the way he moved sure and unhurried like the land itself. When he turned, he raised a hand. "That gray's yours if you want her. She's steady. Bit jumpy with new riders, but she settles if you're patient." Delaney stepped down from the porch. "What's her name?" "Lark. She was born the same spring doves nested in the barn rafters. Thought it fit." Lark's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. Delaney approached slow, palm out. The mare sniffed her fingers, then leaned her head forward, nudging gently. "I've only ever ridden mules," Delaney said, keeping her hand steady, "and only when I had to." "She'll teach you what she knows," Abram replied. "Long as you listen." Delaney smiled faintly, looking up at him. "That's something you think I need to learn?" He met her gaze, then shrugged, not unkindly. "We all do." He led Lark into the smaller paddock, then opened the gate for her. "You want to give her a try?" Delaney nodded and climbed the rail fence with more grace than she expected from herself. Abram offered no saddle, just a bridle and a quiet word to the mare. Delaney swung up, gripping with her knees the way she'd seen others do. Lark shifted beneath her but didn't pull away. She rode a slow circle, Abram walking beside, his hand never more than a breath from the reins. By the third pass, Delaney sat straighter and the mare moved easier. When she dismounted, Abram handed her a cloth to wipe her hands. "There's a good seed in you, just needs use." "I never pictured a life like this," she said, glancing at the hills. "I thought I'd be in town, maybe teaching, maybe just keeping house." "You still can. Whatever you want to make of it." Delaney leaned against the fence beside him. "What did you want before yesterday?" He looked out toward the far ridge where the morning light caught the tops of the mesquites. "I thought I'd stay alone, didn't figure myself fit for anything else." She didn't press. Instead, she followed his gaze, letting the quiet settle between them. Inside, she found a thin tin box on the shelf near the hearth thread, needles, a few buttons. She took it to the table, unpinned her veil from the day before, and began stitching its torn edge. Abram entered, dust on his sleeves, fingers stained with saddle oil. He watched her work, then pulled a chair beside her. "You sew well. Ma taught me using feed sacks and old shirts. Said a woman ought to know how to make do. She taught you true." Delaney didn't answer right away. Her needle moved in slow, careful arcs. "You said your folks left the territory years ago. You've been here alone ever since," he nodded. My father sold our last stretch of land near Yuma when the mines dried up. Tried to follow the railroad east. I stayed, took work where I could, then bought this place when the man who owned it died without kin. You ever think of leaving? Once. Then I saw the way the light hits the ridge come fall, decided no other place would feel like mine. Delaney tied off the thread and smoothed the repaired veil. You kept it, he said. I couldn't throw it away, not after. She stopped, then glanced at him. Not after you made it matter. He sat back, arms folded. We'll have to call on the neighbors soon. Folks'll talk if they hear we married and stayed holed up. Let them talk, she said, but her voice held no bite. Though I suppose some company might be nice. There's a family just over the rise, the Mertons. They run sheep and have a girl near your age. I'll take you over tomorrow. Delaney nodded. I'd like that. She stood and carried the sewing kit back to the shelf. Abram reached for the kettle, poured water into 2 cups and handed her one. They stood by the window while the day widened, the silence between them shaded with ease now. Everything ahead was still uncertain, but the fear had softened. There was steadiness in the way he looked at her, in the way he didn't try to fill the air with promises. He just stood there beside her, like he meant to stay. The next morning brought a wind off the ridge that carried the smell of sage and far-off rain. Delaney stood in the narrow hallway with her hand brushing the frame of a door she hadn't opened yet. Across the threshold lay a room with shelves built from rough pine, a desk cluttered with ledgers and folded maps, and a window that faced east toward the long slope of desert plain. Abram's handwriting marked the margins of a calendar nailed beside the window dates, notched with branding times, fence repairs, a delivery from Silver Bell. He was outside hitching the wagon. They'd be heading to the Mertons before the sun crested the pass. She'd braided her hair back tight, slipped into a calico blouse and a skirt that reached her boots. The air carried a coolness she hadn't expected, and she welcomed it as she stepped onto the porch and climbed into the seat beside him. You ever meet them? She asked as he handed her the reins. Once, when you got tangled in my fence line. Charlie Merton came by with his boy, brought a jar of peach conserve by way of thanks. She nodded, adjusting her grip. I never drove a team. They're quiet horses. Keep your hands firm, not hard. The road bent through a dry wash, then rose into a narrow pass where the wagon wheels groaned against packed stone. He didn't talk much, and she didn't mind. His presence was something she'd started to settle into, like the way a house feels lived in after the first rain. At the Mertons' place, the house stood low and broad, with a windmill ticking overhead and smoke curling from a side chimney. A girl in a sun-faded dress came down the steps, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, a basket tucked under one arm. She had the same flaxen hair as the man who followed behind her. You Abram Teller? The older man asked, pausing at the last step. I am. This is my wife, Delaney. The words settled over her like a second breeze, unexpected but not unwelcome. Charlie Merton nodded and reached out a hand. Charlie, this here's my daughter, Ruth. My wife's tending the root cellar. You're welcome to come in. Delaney stepped down and followed Ruth toward the back of the house, past a coop where hens wandered loose and a dog dozed in the shade. Inside, the kitchen smelled of yeast and onions. The older woman, Mrs. Merton, rose from a crouch beside the cellar door with a jar in hand and a streak of flour on her cheek. I heard you married yesterday, she said without pause, setting the jar on a shelf. Yes, ma'am. Well, that's something worth warming bread for. Sit. Ruth, pour the cider. Conversation turned easy. Ruth asked whether Delaney had always lived in the territory, and when she heard she hadn't, she tilted her head. You come far, from Prescott by way of Fort Verde, but that was years ago now. Ruth glanced at her mother, then back. We don't see many women out here who aren't born to it. I wasn't either, Delaney said, a little surprised, but I think I might be now. The older woman smiled beneath her lashes. That's what makes you last. Later, while the men inspected a broken fence post at the edge of the corral, Ruth led Delaney to a narrow plot behind the house where rows of carrots and string beans grew between rocks. "You planting a garden?" Ruth asked, brushing dust from a squash leaf. "I hadn't thought that far. You'll want one. It helps come dry season, and so does knowing someone nearby." Delaney squatted beside a row of onions. "I don't know what I'm doing half the time, none of us do. We just learn fast or starve slower." They laughed then, not loud, but enough that the hens scattered. When the sun dipped toward late afternoon, Abram loaded the basket Mrs. Merton had filled with smoked pork, turnips, and a square of molasses cake wrapped in linen. Charlie clapped him on the shoulder. "Come by next week, bring her again, there's a quilting circle, she'd be welcome." On the ride home, Delaney traced a finger along the edge of the basket. "She said I'd be welcome," she murmured. "You are." She looked over at him. His jaw was sunburnt along the line of his collar, his hat tipped forward, shading his eyes. "I didn't expect to feel that." "What?" Like I belonged. He looked at her then, not just a glance, but long enough for her to feel it settle in her chest. "You do, Delaney." And not just with them. The horses moved steady beneath them, the creak of leather and wood the only sound between their words. Back at the ranch, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the porch. Abram unpacked the basket while she lit the lamp and rinsed her hands in the basin. She stood in the doorway watching him unwrap the cake. "You think we'll be all right?" she asked. He turned, holding half the loaf in a tin plate. "I think we already are." He crossed the room, handed her the plate, then reached for her free hand, his thumb brushing the inside of her wrist. She leaned into him, feeling the steadiness of his breath and the quiet promise of his presence. Whatever came next, it would be faced together. Not with certainty, but with the kind of trust that didn't need words. Rain came slow, a hush over the land that softened the dust and turned the air sweet with creosote. Delaney stood beneath the porch overhang, watching the drops bead along the rail. The soil would drink it up before morning, but for now the world felt quieter, closer. Inside, Abram set a tin of coffee on the stove, the fire throwing shadows against the plank walls. He glanced toward her, then wiped his hands on a towel. Storms passing east. "Shouldn't wash out the creek road." She turned, brushing damp from her sleeves. "I was hoping it'd last longer. It's early yet. Could break again before sundown." She stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind her. "You ever been past the Gila?" "Once." Drove cattle toward Duncan. "Dry country out that way, mean heat." He poured the coffee and handed her a cup, his fingers brushing hers. "Why do you ask?" "I had a cousin who settled near Clifton. Wrote once about the copper mines, said the hills turned red with the dust. I used to imagine her in a house full of noise and iron." "You close." "Not really. But I used to think if I ever left Prescott, I'd find her. Maybe work in a boarding house or teach miners' children their letters." "You still think of leaving?" She sipped the coffee, its bitterness grounding. "No, I just wonder what kind of woman I'd have become if I had." Abram leaned against the counter, arms folded. "I figure you're the kind you were meant to be, right here." She sat at the table, the legs creaking beneath her weight. "Do you ever regret staying?" He didn't answer at first. The fire snapped once, then settled. "Regret's a thing I keep behind me. I've known loss, sure, same as anyone who's lived long enough, but staying gave me roots, and now it's given me you." Delaney looked down at her hands, calloused now in places they hadn't been before. "I've been thinking about the land behind the barn." "What about it?" "There's space for a clothesline, maybe a row of herbs, if I can clear the thistle." He set his cup down. "I'll help dig out the roots." "That soil's hard-packed. I can manage. You don't have to." She met his eyes, her voice quiet. "I know, but I need to." He nodded once. "All right." That afternoon, the clouds broke into strips of light and shadow. Delaney tied a scarf at her neck and carried a spade to the back lot. The earth was stubborn, layered with rock and stray scrub, but she knelt anyway, hands deep in the dirt. Before long, from the barn, Abram watched her work. He didn't interrupt. At dusk, he joined her, sleeves rolled and boots caked in mud, and wordlessly took up the second spade. Later, they sat on the porch steps, legs stretched out, the scent of turned earth on their clothes. Abram rested his hand against his knee, fingers grazing hers. Delaney tilted her head toward the hills. "You ever think about children?" He was quiet a moment. "Sometimes. But I never thought I'd have the right life to raise them." She turned toward him. "And now, I think if they had your steadiness and your fire, they'd be the kind of people I'd be proud to know." She looked down at the space between their hands. "I'd want them to know how to plant things. How to wait for them to grow." His thumb brushed lightly against hers. "We've got the time." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet cedar. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called long and low. Delaney leaned into him, her shoulder against his. He didn't move away. "I never thought I'd find this," she said. He tipped his head, voice just above a whisper. "You didn't find it, you built it." She closed her eyes, listening to the quiet settle between them like something earned. The last frost came early that year, and the mesquite trees stood bare-limbed, their branches scratching the pale sky like charcoal strokes. Delaney pulled her shawl tighter as she stepped down from the porch, her boots pressing into soil that had finally softened after weeks of digging and tending. The herb rose had taken, small green shoots stubborn against the cold. She knelt beside the mint, pinching off a stem to dry for tea. Behind her, the barn door creaked open. Abram emerged, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder and a saddle blanket over the other. His hair was damp, curls darkened from washing at the pump, and he walked with a quiet rhythm she recognized now as contentment. "We'll need to ride down to the trading post tomorrow," he said, stopping beside her. "I bartered for a bag of cornmeal and some beeswax. Trader said he'd hold it through week's end. Do you trust him to keep his word?" She stood, brushing her hands clean against her skirt. "I don't trust much," Abram said, "but I reckon he's more afraid of losing future trade than gaining one dishonest deal." They walked side by side toward the house. A hawk circled overhead, wings stretched wide against the wind. Delaney watched it a moment before speaking again. "I've been thinking about offering a school term come spring. Just a few hours a day. The Merton girl said there's 3 children over the next ridge that can't read and no one to teach them." Abram stopped at the stoop, adjusting the coil of rope on his shoulder. "You think you've got time enough with everything else?" "If I start after planting and end before harvest, I think I can manage. You want me to build something for it? A table, maybe a bench or two?" "I'd like that," she said. "And I've got the old slate board from the back shelf. It still writes clean." He stood there a moment, eyes steady on hers. "You're building more than a garden out here." Delaney reached for the door. "So are you." That evening, the fire burned low and steady. They ate by lamplight, sharing the last of the smoked trout and a heel of sour bread. Afterward, Abram reached into the wooden box tucked beside the hearth and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He laid it on the table between them. "I never showed you this," he said, tapping the corner of the page. "It's the deed, signed proper. This land's ours, not just mine." She stared down at the faded ink, the familiar slope of his name beside the old seal. "I never asked for that," she said softly. "I know, but I wanted to." Her throat tightened as she folded it back carefully. "Then we'll keep it safe." They passed the rest of the evening in quiet work. Abram carved a handle for the kitchen drawer that had gone loose. Delaney patched a tear in the curtain beside the cot. Every movement felt like a stitch in something larger, something they were shaping with each hour. When the fire dimmed and the wind picked up outside, they climbed into the small bed, the quilt pulled tight against the cold. Delaney turned into him, her hand resting on his chest. "Do you ever think of what might have happened if you hadn't ridden past that chapel?" she asked. "I did once. And now," he kissed her hair, slow and soft. "Now I just think how lucky I was to be there when I was." She didn't answer, only pressed herself closer, listening to the rhythm of his breath beneath her palm. The days that followed brought more clarity than uncertainty. Abram reinforced the fence posts before the next rain and repaired the hinge on the shed door. Delaney received a parcel from Ruth Scrap Cloth, a half-used primer, and a note offering to send her youngest brother to learn letters when spring came. By mid-March, The soil behind the barn held neat rows of sprouting beans and wild lettuce. The hens had begun to lay again, and the coop sang each morning with clucks and flutter. Abram built a low table from reclaimed pine, smoothing the edges with beeswax and placing it beneath the kitchen window where the light pooled warm and golden. One morning, Delaney stood beside the table, her apron dusted with flour, and said without looking up, "I think I'm carrying." He didn't speak right away. She turned then, flour on her cheek, searching his face. When he stepped forward, his hands cupped her waist gently, reverently. "You certain?" he asked. "I'm late, and I feel it, deeper than anything else." He rested his forehead to hers. "We'll raise them strong," she nodded against him. "We'll raise them kind." Months passed. The school term began with 4 children seated cross-legged at the new table, their eyes wide and curious. Abram set a bell on the fence post to call them in, and each morning Delaney rang it with a steady arm. The pregnancy was not easy. She carried low and tired, and the heat of June settled heavy, but Abram never left her to bear it alone. He hauled water, cooked when her back ached, and rubbed her hands when they swelled. He never once asked her to slow down. He simply stood beside her, ready when she needed him. Early autumn brought the birth. A long night, quiet and hard, but when it was over, a daughter lay against Delaney's chest, her cry soft and sure. They named her June, after the month Delaney first felt her stir. Abram built a cradle from mesquite, carved with small flowers along the edge. Delaney sewed the blanket herself from scraps Ruth had sent, blues stitched beside faded reds worn soft from wash. On the porch one evening, Delaney rocked June while Abram strung a line of lanterns across the awning, their glow warm against the dusk. The scent of bread drifted from the kitchen, and the low hum of crickets rose from the grass. "You ever still think about the kind of woman you might have become somewhere else?" Abram asked. She looked down at their daughter, her fingers curled tight around Delaney's thumb. "No, I became the woman I was meant to be right here." He sat beside her, arms slipping around her shoulders. "You gave this place life. You gave me a place to plant it." They sat there as the light faded, the land quiet, the house full. Inside, the fire would keep through the night. Outside, the stars blinked into view one by one. They had no need for more words. What they'd built between them didn't rely on saying. It was in the soil, the walls, the child sleeping in their arms, and it would hold, always.